In the quiet hum of a late Atlanta evening, when the streetlights cast long shadows over manicured lawns and the distant sound of traffic faded into a soft murmur, a modest colonial-style house stood nestled at the end of a tree-lined cul-de-sac. It wasn't the biggest home on the block, but it carried a quiet dignity. Well-kept shutters, freshly painted white trim, and a front porch where no one ever sat. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books, a scent that lingered from years of careful upkeep and solitude. The man who lived there was in his early 60s, though his posture and the careful way he moved made him seem older. He'd built his fortune brick by brick, deal by deal, starting with a single rental property he'd fixed up with his own hands in his 20s. Over the decades, that one property became 10, then 50, then a small empire of apartment complexes and commercial spaces across the Southeast. He wasn't flashy about it. No luxury cars in the driveway, no gold watches, no parties. Just a quiet life shaped by discipline and loss. His wife had passed away 7 years earlier after a long illness, and since then, the house had grown quieter, emptier, like a room with the lights turned off. He lived alone now, but not entirely. There was one person who kept the rhythm of the place steady, a woman who arrived before sunrise and stayed long after sunset. She'd been with him for 3 years, ever since the last housekeeper retired and moved to Florida. This woman wasn't loud or chatty. She moved through the house like a gentle breeze, tidying, dusting, folding laundry with hands that never stopped working. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then, her voice was soft, careful, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space. She came from a small village in Central America, a place where electricity was still unreliable and school ended for most kids by age 12. She'd crossed borders not for adventure but necessity, leaving behind a younger sister she still sent money to every month, and parents whose faces she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. In this country, she worked 2 jobs at first, days cleaning offices downtown, nights scrubbing floors in a hospital. But when she got the position at the big house on Oak Ridge Lane, she saw it as a blessing. Steady pay, a small room to sleep in, no commute, and, most importantly, privacy. Her room was modest, a converted sunroom at the back of the house tucked behind the kitchen. It had a narrow bed, a dresser with a wobbly leg, and a window that looked out onto the garden. Nothing fancy, but it was hers. And every night after she'd finished folding the last towel, wiping down the last countertop, and turning off the last light in the main house, she'd slip into her room, close the door softly, and begin the part of her day that no one knew about. Because while the rest of the neighborhood slept, she studied. It started with a GED prep book she'd bought at a thrift store for $3. The pages were dog-eared and stained with coffee rings, but she treated it like treasure. She'd sit at the small desk, a repurposed TV tray she'd found in the garage, and open her laptop, an old model someone had donated to the community center where she sometimes volunteered. The screen flickered, the battery barely held a charge, but it worked. And with it, she logged into free online courses, watched videos about algebra and U.S. history, and typed essays with 2 fingers, correcting her grammar over and over until it sounded right. She wanted more, not for fame or fortune, but for stability, for the chance to help others like her, people who worked hard but were told their dreams were too big for their station. She dreamed of becoming a social worker, of walking into shelters and saying, "I've been where you are," and meaning it. But to do that, she needed a diploma, then a degree, and that meant studying late into the night after a 12-hour workday with tired eyes and aching feet. She never complained. She never asked for anything extra. She knew her place, or at least she thought she did. In her mind, her job was to clean, to cook, to keep the house running smoothly. Anything beyond that was a risk. What if her employer thought she wasn't focused? What if he believed she was wasting time? She'd heard stories from other domestic workers, people fired for acting above their role, for daring to want more. So she kept her books hidden under her mattress, her laptop tucked in a shoebox when not in use, and her dreams locked away like secrets. The man in the house never suspected a thing. He saw her as reliable, quiet, efficient. He appreciated that she never gossiped, never asked personal questions, never lingered in rooms where she wasn't needed. He paid her fairly, above minimum wage, with occasional bonuses around holidays, but he didn't know her. Not really. He didn't know that she saved every extra dollar in a jar labeled school, or that she skipped meals sometimes to afford a new textbook. He didn't know she practiced English pronunciation in the shower, whispering words like opportunity and resilience until they rolled off her tongue without hesitation. Their interactions were polite but distant. "Good morning. Dinner will be ready at 6. The laundry is folded in the basket." That was the extent of it. He assumed she was content with her life. She assumed he saw her as nothing more than help. But life has a way of revealing truths when we least expect them. One Tuesday in late October, the weather turned unseasonably cold. Rain tapped against the windows like impatient fingers, and a damp chill seeped into the house despite the heating system humming in the basement. The man couldn't sleep. His mind was restless, tangled in memories of his wife and a business decision he'd been putting off. Around 1:30 a.m., he gave up, pulled on a robe, and shuffled downstairs for a glass of water. The house was dark except for a sliver of light beneath the sunroom door. He paused. That was unusual. She always turned in by 10. He'd noticed not out of suspicion, but because the house felt different when all the lights were out, like it could finally breathe. Curious, he walked closer. The door wasn't locked. He didn't mean to spy, but something about that thin line of light pulled at him. Gently, he pushed the door open just enough to see inside. And there she was, sitting at the rickety desk, bathed in the glow of a small lamp with a frayed cord. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, strands escaping around her face. Her shoulders were hunched forward, eyes fixed on a page filled with equations. A pencil was tucked behind her ear, and her fingers moved slowly across the keyboard, pausing, backspacing, trying again. Empty coffee mugs sat on the floor beside her. A blanket was draped over her legs, but her feet were bare, curled under the chair for warmth. She didn't hear him. She was too deep in her world, the world of variables and historical dates and grammar rules that didn't come naturally, but were being wrestled into place through sheer will. He stood there, unmoving for nearly a full minute. His first thought wasn't annoyance or suspicion. It was awe. He hadn't seen that kind of quiet determination in years, not since his wife used to stay up late grading papers for her adult literacy class, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, muttering encouragement to students who'd never held a diploma. He remembered how she'd say, "Everyone deserves a second chance to learn. It's never too late." A lump formed in his throat. He stepped back quietly, closed the door without a sound, and returned to his room. But he didn't go back to sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed staring at the wall thinking, who was this woman who cleaned his floors and cooked his meals? He realized with a pang of shame that he didn't really know. He knew her schedule, her efficiency, her punctuality, but not her hopes, her struggles, her late-night sacrifices. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but deeply, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward. He thought about his own past. How he'd dropped out of college after his father lost everything in a bad investment. How he'd worked construction jobs, slept in his truck, and taught himself real estate law from library books. No one had handed him a break. But someone had once lent him $50 to buy his first set of tools, and that small act had changed everything. Now, standing in the hallway of his own home, he saw a reflection of his younger self in that quiet woman with the worn-out shoes and the dog-eared textbook. He didn't say anything the next day. He watched her move through her routine, making his coffee just the way he liked it, fluffing the couch pillows, humming softly under her breath as she wiped down the kitchen counters. She seemed tired, but she never slowed down. And when their eyes met briefly at lunch, she offered a small, polite smile before looking away. He let the days pass. He wanted to be sure. He wanted to understand. So he asked the house manager, a part-time coordinator who handled payroll and schedules, a few casual questions. How long has she been with us? Does she ever take time off? Any issues I should know about? The answer surprised him. She'd never missed a day. She'd turned down vacation days because someone needs to cover the house. And when asked if she had other jobs, the manager said no. This was her only position now. She'd quit her second job 6 months ago to focus on something important, though she hadn't said what. That confirmed it. She wasn't distracted. She was driven. And that night, as he lay in bed listening to the rain return, he made a decision. Not out of pity, not out of guilt, but out of respect. He remembered a conversation he'd had with his wife years ago. Sitting on this very porch watching fireflies blink in the summer dusk, she'd said, "The greatest gift you can give someone isn't money, it's belief. Believing in them when they can't believe in themselves." He hadn't understood it fully then. But now, he did. And so, 2 mornings later, after she'd finished setting the breakfast table and was about to retreat to the laundry room, he called her name. Not sharply, but gently. She turned, eyes wide with the kind of caution that comes from years of being careful around people in power. "Could you come into the study for a moment?" he asked. Her heart dropped. This was it. She'd been too tired yesterday, maybe left a spot on the mirror, or maybe he'd heard her typing late at night and thought she was wasting electricity. She braced herself, smoothing her uniform, walking slowly toward the study like someone approaching a verdict. But what happened next wasn't punishment. It was the beginning of something neither of them saw coming. And though that moment belonged to the next part of their story, the truth was already written in the quiet hours before dawn, in the glow of a lamp, the scratch of a pencil, and the unspoken courage of someone who refused to let her circumstances define her future. The morning after he saw her studying, the man moved through his house like a ghost, quiet, thoughtful, distant. He ate his breakfast without tasting it, stared out the window while sipping coffee that had gone cold, and canceled a mid-morning meeting with a contractor, saying he wasn't feeling well, but it wasn't illness that weighed on him. It was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years, a stirring of purpose. He kept replaying the image in his mind, her hunched over that tiny desk, eyes tired but sharp, fingers tracing, lines in a textbook like they were searching for a map to a better life. He remembered how his own hands used to shake from exhaustion when he was starting out, how he'd fall asleep on library floors with books open on his chest. No one had noticed him then. No one had cared enough to ask. Now, someone was right. Here, in his home, working for him. And he'd been blind to her struggle. That realization sat heavy in his chest, not as guilt, but as a quiet call to do better. He didn't rush. He knew that sudden kindness from someone in power could feel like pity, and pity could wound more than indifference. So he waited. He watched. He listened. Over the next 2 days, he paid attention in ways he never had before. He noticed how she always saved the leftover bread from his toast to take for lunch, how she mended a tear in the kitchen curtain with careful stitches instead of asking for a replacement, how she never turned on the heater in her room, even on chilly nights, probably to save on electricity. Small things, but they spoke volumes. He also noticed the way she looked at books, not with longing exactly, but with reverence. Once, while dusting the study, she paused by the bookshelf, her fingers hovering over a spine like she wanted to touch it but didn't dare. She glanced around quickly as if checking if anyone was watching, then moved on. That small hesitation told him everything. She respected knowledge, but she didn't believe it belonged to her. That broke something open inside him. On the 3rd day, he drove into the city, not to his office but to a community college downtown. He walked in like any visitor, though he hadn't set foot in a school in over 40 years. The air smelled like chalk and coffee. Students hurried past with backpacks slung over one shoulder, laughing, arguing, dreaming out loud. He felt out of place, but he didn't care. He found the admissions office and asked a young woman behind the desk how much it would cost for someone to go from a GED to an associate's degree in social work. The woman blinked, surprised by the question, but answered kindly. She explained tuition, books, exam fees, part-time options. He listened carefully, taking notes on the back of an old receipt. Then he went to a bookstore and bought a brand new GED study guide, hardcover, full color, with practice tests and online access. He also picked up a notebook with a smooth cover and a set of fine-tip pens. On the way home, he stopped at a small electronics store and bought a refurbished laptop. Lightweight, reliable, with a warranty. It wasn't flashy, but it was new to her. Back at the house, he sat at his desk for hours. He wrote a letter, not long, just a few sentences, but he rewrote it 3 times until it sounded right. He didn't want it to sound like charity. He wanted it to sound like trust. Then he wrote a check. Not a small one. Enough to cover 2 full years of community college, including books, fees, and a little extra for emergencies. He sealed everything, in a plain white envelope addressed to no one, just labeled "For You." He waited until late afternoon when the house was quiet and she was folding towels in the laundry room. He took a deep breath, walked down the hall, and knocked lightly on the open door. She looked up, startled. "Yes, sir?" "Could you come into the study for a moment?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Her stomach dropped. This was it. She'd been too slow with the silverware polishing yesterday. Or maybe he'd heard her coughing last night and thought she was sick and should be sent home. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the towel and smoothed her uniform. She followed him down the hall, her shoes silent on the hardwood floor. The study was tidy, as always. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching dust motes in the air. He stood behind his desk, hands resting on the polished wood. She stood just inside the doorway, eyes lowered, arms clasped in front of her like she was bracing for impact. He didn't make her wait. Without a word, he slid the envelope across the desk toward her. She stared at it, like it might burn her. "Sir, what is this?" "Open it," he said gently. Her fingers fumbled with the seal. She pulled out the letter first. Her eyes scanned the words slowly, her lips moving slightly as she read. "I saw you studying the other night. I didn't mean to intrude, but I want you to know, I'm proud of you. This isn't a gift, it's an investment in you, in your future, in the good you'll do in this world. Keep your job. Your hours will be adjusted so you can attend classes. If you need a quiet place to study during the day, use the guest room. And don't thank me yet. Just promise me you'll finish what you started." Below that was the check. She saw the number and gasped. Her knees nearly gave out. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. Tears welled up instantly, blurring the numbers, the words, the room. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Her throat tightened like a fist. I can't," she finally whispered, shaking her head. "This is too much. I didn't ask for this." "I know you didn't," he said softly. "That's why it matters." She looked up at him then. Really looked. Not as an employee to an employer, but as one human to another. And in his eyes, she didn't see pity. She saw recognition, respect. Maybe even a flicker of the same fire she carried inside herself. "I've been saving," she said quickly, as if defending herself. "I was going to pay for it myself. Slowly, but I would have." "You still can," he interrupted gently. "Use this to move faster, to breathe easier, to focus on learning, not on how you'll afford the next book." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed by the tears but unable to stop them. "Why?" she asked, voice cracking. "Why would you do this for me?" He hesitated. Then he walked around the desk and sat in the chair beside her, not behind it, so they were on the same level. "My wife," he began. "She used to teach adults how to read. People who'd been told they were too old, too poor, too broken to learn. She said education wasn't just about degrees, it was about dignity, about giving someone the tools to stand on their own." He looked out the window for a moment, as if seeing her in the garden they'd planted together years ago. "She'd be furious with me if she knew I had someone like you in my house, working your fingers to the bone, studying through the night, and I didn't lift a finger to help." She didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever seen her as anything more than a pair of hands that cleaned, cooked, and disappeared. "I won't let you down," she said finally, clutching the envelope to her chest, like it was a lifeline. "I know you won't," he replied. "But even if you did, even if you changed your mind tomorrow, that wouldn't change what I believe about you." That stunned her more than the money, because it wasn't conditional. It wasn't about results. It was about her worth just as she was. They sat in silence for a while, The only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Then she stood, still holding the envelope, and gave a small nod. Not a bow, not a gesture of subservience, but a quiet thank you that carried more weight than words. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't make a speech. He just said, "Go finish your day, and tonight then study without worrying about the light under your door." She walked out slowly, her steps lighter than they'd been in years. Back in her room, she locked the door, not out of fear but to give herself space to fall apart. She sank onto the bed, the envelope still pressed against her heart, and sobbed. Great heaving cries of relief, disbelief, and hope. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. That night, she didn't study right away. Instead, she opened the new GED book and ran her fingers over the crisp pages. She turned on the new laptop, marveling at how fast it booted up. She placed the check in the shoebox under her bed, the same one that held her sister's letters and a photo of her parents. But this time, it wasn't just a box of memories. It was a box of possibility. Over the next few days, things changed in subtle but powerful ways. He didn't treat her differently in front of others. No grand announcements, no awkward praise. But he started leaving the guest room door open during the day with a note on the desk. Quiet space. Help yourself to coffee. She began using it, bringing her books and laptop, studying while the house was empty. He also adjusted her schedule without being asked. "You can start an hour later on Tuesdays and Thursdays," he said casually over breakfast one morning. "I'll manage." She knew those were the days her community college offered evening classes. He'd looked it up. One afternoon, while she was reviewing biology notes in the guest room, he knocked lightly and handed her a thermos. "Homemade soup," he said. "You look like you skipped lunch again." She hadn't, but she took it anyway, touched by the quiet care. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. A new understanding had settled between them, unspoken, but solid as stone. And then one rainy Saturday, he did something unexpected. He came to her room not to check on her, not to give instructions, but to ask a question. He stood in the doorway, holding a thick book on real estate law. "I never finished college," he admitted, voice low. "I taught myself most of what I know. But some of this, it's hard to understand alone. Would you maybe help me go over a few chapters sometime, if you're not too busy with your own work?" She stared at him, stunned. He wasn't asking for help because he needed it. He was giving her a chance to teach, to be the expert, to stand on equal ground. "Yes," she said, smiling for the first time in his presence without hesitation. "I'd like that." From that day on, their roles began to blur, not in a way that confused boundaries, but in a way that honored them. She was still his employee. He was still her employer. But in the quiet hours of the afternoon, over open books and steaming mugs of tea, they were simply two people learning from each other. And in that shared space, between calculus problems and property deeds, between GED flashcards and old legal texts, something rare and beautiful grew. Mutual respect, wrapped in quiet acts of courage and kindness. No one saw it happening. No cameras rolled. No headlines were written. But in that ordinary house on an ordinary street, an extraordinary shift was taking place, one that would ripple far beyond those walls, long after the textbooks were closed and the degrees were earned. Weeks passed, and the house settled into a new rhythm, one that felt less like a workplace and more like a shared space where two lives quietly supported each other. She still cleaned, cooked, and kept the home running smoothly, but now her days had room to breathe. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she left early for evening classes at the community college, returning just before midnight with her backpack slung over one shoulder and her eyes bright with the kind of tired that comes from learning, not just laboring. He never asked how class went. Instead, he'd leave a plate of food covered with foil on the kitchen counter and a note that simply said, "Eat, rest, tomorrow's another page." She began to carry herself differently, not with arrogance, but with a quiet confidence that seemed to grow with every quiz she passed, every essay she turned in. She stopped hiding her books. They sat openly on the guest room desk now, biology, psychology, U.S. government, spines cracked from use, margins filled with her careful handwriting. Sometimes when he walked past the open door, he'd see her reading aloud to herself, practicing pronunciation, or sketching diagrams to remember complex ideas. He never interrupted. He just smiled to himself and kept walking, as if guarding a secret he was honored to witness. One Saturday morning, while she was reviewing flashcards at the kitchen table, he came in holding a folded newspaper. He set it down beside her coffee mug without a word and pointed to a small ad in the classifieds. Volunteer tutor needed, adult literacy program, flexible hours. She looked up at him. Confused. "You're ready," he said simply. She wasn't so sure. "I haven't even finished my GED yet," she protested. "What if I mess up?" "Then you'll learn how to fix it," he replied. That's what teaching is. The truth was he'd been thinking about this for a while. He remembered how his wife used to say that the moment you start helping someone else learn is the moment your own understanding deepens. He also knew that for someone like her, who'd spent years feeling invisible, being asked to teach, even in a small way, could be healing. She applied the next day. A week later, she stood in a brightly lit community center, facing a group of adults who looked just as nervous as she felt. Some were immigrants like her. Others were older men and women who'd dropped out of school decades ago. All of them carried the same quiet shame she once knew, the belief that it was too late for them. But when she opened her mouth to speak, something surprising happened. Her voice didn't shake. She explained fractions using grocery receipts. She turned grammar lessons into stories about her village. She didn't pretend to have all the answers. Sometimes she'd say, "Let me check that and get back to you tomorrow." And that honesty made her trustworthy. After the first session, one woman pulled her aside and said, "You talk like you've been where we are." She nodded. "Because I have." That night, she told him about it over dinner. Well, over the meal he insisted she eat with him now, not in her room. "They listened to me," she said, still amazed. "Like I mattered." "You do matter," he said, not looking up from his plate as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. Their bond deepened in small, ordinary ways. He started asking her opinion on things. What color to paint the guest bathroom, whether to donate old furniture or sell it. She in turn began sharing bits of her life. How her sister was doing in school back home. How her mother's garden bloomed every spring with red hibiscus. How she missed the sound of rain on a tin roof. He listened without judgment, without trying to fix anything. He just let her be seen. Then came the day of her GED exam. She'd studied for months. She'd taken practice tests until her eyes burned. She'd stayed up late reviewing science diagrams and historical timelines. But the night before the test, she couldn't sleep. Doubt crept in like a cold draft under the door. What if she failed? What if she wasn't smart enough? What if all this, his belief, her hope, was just a dream that would shatter in one bad score? At 5 a.m., she was already dressed, pacing her room. She heard footsteps in the hall. He appeared at her door, fully dressed, holding 2 travel mugs. "Thought you might need company," he said. She blinked. "You're coming with me?" "I've got nothing better to do at 6 in the morning," he said with a small shrug. "Besides, someone should make sure you eat breakfast." They drove in silence, the city still asleep around them. At the testing center, a modest brick building near the college, he walked her to the front door. She clutched her ID and admission slip like a lifeline. "You've got this," he said, not with false cheer, but with quiet certainty. She nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. He didn't leave. He sat in his car for 3 hours, reading a book he wasn't really reading, just waiting. When she finally came out, her face was pale, her hands trembling. He didn't ask how it went. He just opened the passenger door and said, "Lunch?" Over burgers at a diner down the street, she finally spoke. "I think I did okay," she whispered. "The math was hard, but I remembered the tricks you showed me," he smiled. "Then you did more than okay." 2 weeks later, the results arrived in the mail. She opened the envelope with shaking hands and burst into tears right there in the hallway. She'd passed. Not just passed, she'd scored in the top 10%. She ran to the study where he was reviewing property leases and held out the letter without a word. He read it slowly, then looked up at her with eyes that glistened just slightly. "Now," he said, "you're officially a student." And so she enrolled, full-time, in the social work program. He kept his promise. Her job remained, but her hours shifted. She worked mornings now, finishing by noon so she could attend afternoon lectures. He hired a part-time helper for heavy cleaning, but insisted she keep her room and her role. "This is your home too," he said, And for the first time she believed him. College wasn't easy. There were nights she came home exhausted, overwhelmed by readings on trauma-informed care or policy analysis. There were moments she felt out of place among students half her age who'd never worked a double shift or sent money home to family they hadn't seen in years. But she kept going because now she wasn't just doing it for herself. She was doing it for the woman at the literacy center who'd hugged her and said, "You give me hope." For her sister who wrote letters saying, "I want to be like you." And for the man who'd seen her in the dark and chosen to turn on a light. One evening, after a particularly tough class on systemic inequality, she sat at the kitchen table, head in her hands. He found her there, surrounded by highlighted textbooks and half-empty coffee cups. "Too much?" he asked gently. She nodded. "I want to help people, but the problems are so big. What can one person do?" He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You don't have to fix everything," he said. "You just have to show up. One person at a time. That's how change starts." She looked at him, really looked, and saw not a millionaire, not a boss, but a man who'd lost love, built something from nothing, and still chose kindness when it would have been easier to stay closed off. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me," he didn't reply. He just reached across the table and gave her hand a brief, firm squeeze, the kind that says, "I'm here," without needing more words. As the semester went on, she began to thrive. She joined a student group that volunteered at shelters. She gave a presentation on immigrant rights that earned a standing ovation from her professor. She even started tutoring other students in math, something she never would have imagined a year ago. And through it all, he watched, not with pride that demanded recognition, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd planted a seed and was now watching it grow toward the sun. Then came the invitation. It arrived in her campus mailbox, a formal letter from the dean's office. They wanted her to speak at the end-of-year student achievement ceremony. She was being honored for academic excellence and community service. Would she give a 5-minute speech? She showed it to him that night, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Me? Speak in front of everyone? Who better?" he said. She spent days writing and rewriting her speech. She wanted to tell the truth, not a polished story, but a real one. About working nights, about fear, about the moment someone chose to believe in her. She didn't mention his name, she knew he wouldn't want that, but she described a quiet act of faith from someone who didn't have to care. The night of the ceremony, he sat in the back row of the auditorium, wearing a simple suit, hands folded in his lap. He didn't tell anyone he was coming. He just wanted to witness it. When she walked onto the stage, she scanned the crowd and found him. Their eyes met for just a second. In that glance, everything was said. Gratitude, respect, the unspoken promise that this was only the beginning. She spoke clearly, her voice steady. She talked about dignity, about how education isn't just about degrees, but about being seen, about how sometimes all it takes is one person saying, "Go ahead," to change a life. Afterward, students and faculty surrounded her, congratulating her, asking for advice. He slipped out quietly before she could find him. But on her seat, he'd left a small envelope. Inside was a note. "Your voice matters. Keep using it." And below it, a brochure for a 4-year university with a sticky note that read, "Next stop?" She held it to her chest and smiled through tears, because now she knew. Her story wasn't ending. It was just getting started. The ceremony ended, but the momentum didn't. Something had shifted, not just in her life, but in the quiet understanding between them. She wasn't just the woman who cleaned the house anymore. She was a student, a speaker, someone with a voice that carried weight beyond these walls. And he? He wasn't just the man who signed the checks. He'd become a steady presence, someone who showed up not with grand gestures but with quiet consistency. That summer, she threw herself into planning her next steps. The brochure he'd left her wasn't just a suggestion. It was a nudge toward something bigger. She researched transfer programs, scholarship deadlines, housing options near the state university. It was overwhelming, but for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to figure it all out alone. One humid afternoon, while she sat at the kitchen table with spreadsheets and university catalogs spread out like a battlefield, he walked in holding 2 glasses of iced tea. He set one down beside her and pulled up a chair. "Tell me what you need," he said. She looked up, surprised. "I don't want to ask for more." "You're not asking," he interrupted gently. "You're planning, and planning is easier with someone to talk it through." So she did. She told him about the social work program at the state university, how it had internships with local nonprofits, how it emphasized community-based solutions, how it could lead to a master's degree. She told him about the cost, the commute, the fear of leaving the safety of what she knew. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't offer to pay for everything. Instead, he asked, "What's your part?" "And what's mine?" She thought about it. "My part is to keep working hard, to get good grades, to show up even when it's hard." "And mine?" he asked. "To believe I can do it," she said softly. He nodded. "Then consider that done." Over the next few weeks, they worked out a new arrangement. She would keep her room at the house. "You'll need a home base," he insisted, "but reduce her hours to weekends only." He'd cover her tuition for the first 2 years at the university, but she'd be responsible for books, transportation, and personal expenses. "You'll earn the rest through work study or part-time jobs," he said. "That way it's yours. Not a handout, a partnership," she agreed. It felt right, balanced, respectful, real. The move to university life wasn't seamless. The campus was bigger, the classes more intense, the expectations higher. She was older than most students and sometimes felt like an outsider in lecture halls filled with teenagers who'd never worried about rent or sent money home to family. But she also brought something they didn't: life experience, resilience, and a deep understanding of what it meant to fight for a chance. She joined a student group focused on immigrant rights. She volunteered at a women's shelter on weekends. And slowly, she began to find her people. Other non-traditional students, single parents, veterans, folks who'd taken winding roads to get here. They studied together in the library, shared meals in the cafeteria, and reminded each other why they were here. Back at the house, things changed too. With her working only on weekends, the place felt quieter during the week. He missed the rhythm of her presence, the soft clink of dishes being washed, the hum of the vacuum in the hallway. But he didn't say anything. He knew this was necessary. Growth always leaves a little emptiness behind. Still, they kept their connection alive. Every Sunday evening after she finished cleaning, they'd sit on the back porch with mugs of tea, hers herbal, his black with a splash of milk, and talk. Not about work or school, but about life. She told him about a professor who reminded her of her favorite teacher back home. He told her about a property he was thinking of turning into affordable housing for single mothers. They debated politics, shared recipes, and sometimes just sat in comfortable silence, watching fireflies blink in the dusk. One Sunday, she brought home a flyer for a campus event. Community Voices, Stories of Resilience. It was a storytelling night where students shared personal experiences related to justice, identity, and hope. She'd been invited to speak. "I'm nervous," she admitted, twisting the flyer in her hands. "It's not just facts this time. It's my story." He looked at her for a long moment. "Your story is your power," he said. "Don't shrink it to make others comfortable." She nodded, taking that in. The night of the event, he showed up again unannounced, sitting in the back row, wearing the same simple jacket he'd worn to her last speech. She saw him as she stepped onto the small stage, and her shoulders relaxed. She spoke about crossing borders, not just physical ones, but the invisible lines people draw around who belongs in certain spaces, like college classrooms, or professional offices, or even quiet suburban homes. She spoke about late nights with textbooks, about shame turning into strength, about the moment someone chose to see her not as help but as human. Afterward, a young woman approached her, eyes red from crying. "I clean offices downtown," she whispered. "I want to go back to school too. How do I start?" That moment, more than any grade or award, told her she was on the right path. As the semester went on, her confidence grew. She started mentoring first-year students in the social work program. She applied for, and won, a competitive internship with a nonprofit that helped domestic workers access legal aid and education. The work was emotional, often heartbreaking, but also deeply meaningful. She sat with women who'd been underpaid, overworked, silenced, and she listened. Not as someone looking down, but as someone who'd stood in their shoes. She brought what she learned back to him, not as a report, but as conversation. Did you know most live-in domestic workers don't have set hours? She asked one evening. They're always on call. No overtime. No breaks. He listened, his expression thoughtful. That's not right, he said simply. A few weeks later, he called a meeting with his property management team. He updated the contracts for all household staff across his personal residences, clear hours, overtime pay, guaranteed days off, and a clause that encouraged continuing education. He didn't announce it. He just did it. When she found out, she didn't say thank you. She just hugged him, briefly, fiercely, and he patted her back like a father might, awkward but full of care. Their bond had become something rare, a mix of mentorship, friendship, and mutual respect that defied easy labels. He never overstepped. She never took for granted. They both understood the line and honored it even as they walked beside it. Then came the day she got the letter. It was a crisp fall morning. She'd just returned from campus, her backpack heavy with case studies and policy briefs. There was an envelope on the kitchen counter with her name on it, official looking, from the university. She opened it with trembling hands. She'd been accepted into the accelerated bachelor's to master's program in social work, full scholarship, including a stipend for living expenses. She read it 3 times before she believed it. She found him in the garden, pruning rose bushes with careful hands. She didn't say a word. She just held out the letter. He read it slowly, then looked up at her, his eyes bright. You did it, he said. We did it, she corrected gently. He shook his head. No, this is all you. I just cleared a little space for you to grow. But she knew better. Space wasn't enough. Someone had to choose to make it. That night they celebrated simply. Homemade pasta, a bottle of cheap wine, and old jazz playing softly from the living room speaker. No speeches, no fanfare. Just 2 people sharing a quiet victory. As the year turned and graduation approached, she began thinking about what came next. Not just a job, but a mission. She wanted to create something. A place where people like her could get support without shame. Where dreams weren't dismissed because of the work someone did with their hands. She mentioned the idea tentatively one evening. What if there was a program that helped domestic workers go back to school? Not just money, but tutoring, childcare, someone to walk with them through the system? He didn't laugh. He didn't say it was unrealistic. He leaned forward and asked, what would it take to start? They spent the next month sketching it out on napkins and notebook paper. She outlined the needs: flexible scheduling, language support, mental health resources. He thought about logistics, funding, partnerships, legal structure. It wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was a plan. And then, one rainy afternoon in April, he handed her a folder. Inside was a proposal for a nonprofit foundation in his late wife's name. The mission: to provide educational scholarships and support services to service industry workers pursuing higher education. He'd already spoken to a lawyer. He'd set aside seed funding, and he wanted her to lead it. You know the need better than anyone, he said, and you've earned the right to build it your way. She stared at the papers, overwhelmed. But I'm still a student. You're also a leader, he said. And this? This is your next classroom. She didn't say yes right away. She thought about it for days. She prayed. She talked to her sister on the phone, who said, Mija, this is why you've been fighting all this time. Finally, she agreed, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And as she sat at the kitchen table that night drafting her first mission statement, she realized something. This wasn't just about helping others. It was about healing the part of herself that once believed she didn't deserve more. By lifting others, she was finally lifting herself. He watched her from the doorway, silent, proud, and deeply moved. He didn't need to say it. But in that moment, they both knew they weren't just changing each other's lives anymore. They were building something that would outlast them both. 5 years had passed since that rainy night when a man saw a light under a door and chose to knock gently instead of turning away. The house on Oak Ridge Lane still stood, its white shutters freshly painted, its garden blooming with the same red hibiscus she'd once described from memory. But everything else had changed, quietly, steadily, like roots growing beneath the soil before the tree finally stretches toward the sky. She wasn't living in the sunroom anymore. She had her own apartment now, just a few miles away, filled with secondhand furniture, shelves of well-worn books, and a small desk where she still studied late into the night. But now it was policy briefs, grant proposals, and training manuals for the staff at her nonprofit. The organization she'd helped build, named after the woman who'd believed in second chances, had grown faster than anyone expected. What started as a pilot program with 3 scholarship recipients had expanded to support over 200 domestic, hospitality, and food service workers each year. They offered GED prep, college counseling, emergency childcare, and even legal aid for workplace rights. And at the center of it all was her, not as a figurehead but as a guide, a listener, someone who still showed up early to make coffee before staff meetings. She never forgot where she came from. Every new hire at the nonprofit went through an orientation that included a simple rule. We don't help people. We walk with them. It was a distinction she'd learned the hard way, that dignity isn't given, it's recognized, and he'd stepped back from day-to-day business, handing over most of his real estate operations to a trusted team. He wasn't retired, not exactly, but he'd redirected his energy. The scholarship fund in his wife's name now had its own board, its own endowment, and a waiting list that stretched into the next calendar year. He still reviewed every application, not to judge, but to remember. Sometimes reading a letter from a dishwasher who wanted to become a nurse or a nanny who dreamed of teaching, he'd see flashes of that quiet woman hunched over a textbook in the glow of a flickering lamp, and it reminded him why he'd started this in the first place. Their friendship had settled into something deep and steady, like old trees whose roots have grown together underground. They still met every Sunday, though now it was often at a cafe downtown or a park bench near her office. They talked less about logistics and more about life, the ache of missing family far away, the joy of seeing a former scholarship recipient graduate, the quiet worry that they weren't doing enough. But mostly they just sat together in the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Then came the invitation. It arrived in a crisp white envelope, addressed to both of them. The city was hosting its annual Community Impact Awards, and they'd been asked to attend, not as guests but as honorees. The foundation would be receiving the Legacy of Service Award, and the mayor wanted them both on stage. She showed him the letter over coffee one morning. "Do you want to go?" she asked. He stirred his cup slowly. "Only if you're comfortable with it." She thought about it. Public recognition still made her uneasy. She'd spent so much of her life trying not to be seen that standing under bright lights felt unnatural. But then she remembered the women in her program, the ones who cried when they passed their first college exam, the ones who whispered, "If you did it, maybe I can too." This wasn't about her. It was about them. "I'll go," she said, "but only if you stand with me." He nodded. Wouldn't miss it. The night of the event, the downtown convention center buzzed with energy. Local leaders, nonprofit directors, teachers, nurses all gathered to celebrate ordinary people doing extraordinary work. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, no jewelry except a small silver pendant her sister had sent from home. He wore a dark suit, his tie slightly crooked, looking more like a proud grandfather than a millionaire. When their names were called, they walked on stage together. The applause was warm, genuine. The mayor spoke about how their partnership had sparked a movement, that rare blend of generosity and grit that turned compassion into action. Then he turned to her. "Would you like to say a few words?" She stepped to the microphone, her hands steady now. She didn't recite a prepared speech. She spoke from the heart. "I used to believe my place in this world was to be quiet, to work hard, and to never ask for more," she began, her voice clear and calm. "I thought dreams were for other people. People with last names that opened doors, people who never had to choose between bus fare and a textbook." She paused, glancing at him. He gave her the smallest nod. "But then someone saw me, not as a maid, not as help, but as a person with a future worth betting on. And that single act of belief, it didn't just change my life. It taught me that real change doesn't start with big speeches or grand plans. It starts with one person choosing to see another fully and saying, 'Go ahead. I've got your back.'" The room fell silent. Then slowly people began to stand, one by one, until the whole audience was on their feet, clapping not just for her but for the idea she represented, that everyone deserves a chance to grow. Afterward, reporters asked for interviews, but she politely declined. She and he slipped out a side door, walking into the cool night air. They didn't speak for a while, just walked down the quiet street, past glowing storefronts and the distant hum of the city. Finally, he said, "You were amazing up there." She smiled. "I just told the truth. And that's the most powerful thing anyone can do." Back at the house, now more of a shared sanctuary than a workplace, they sat on the porch with mugs of tea, just like they had so many Sundays before. Fireflies blinked in the garden. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. The world kept turning, ordinary and beautiful. "I've been thinking," she said after a while, "we should expand the program to other cities. Maybe even start a national network." He didn't laugh or say it was too ambitious. He just asked, "What do you need?" She told him, more staff, seed funding, partnerships with community colleges. He listened, nodding, already running numbers in his head. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think success was about how much you could build, how much you could own. But watching you, I realize it's about how many lives you can lift while you're here." She looked at him, her eyes soft. "You lifted me." "No," he said gently. "You were already rising. I just handed you a ladder." They sat in silence for a long time after that, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. No fanfare, no cameras, just two people who'd found each other at the right time and chose, every day, to do the right thing. In the months that followed, their work continued, not with headlines but with handshakes, late-night emails, and small victories that added up to something big. A housekeeper became a licensed counselor. A janitor earned his engineering degree. A cook opened a community kitchen that also offered literacy classes. Each story was a thread in a larger tapestry they'd helped weave. And though the world rarely noticed the quiet moments, the envelope slipped under a door, the extra hour granted for class, the belief offered without condition, those were the moments that changed everything. Years later, long after the award ceremony had faded from memory, a young woman sat in the sunroom of that same house, now part of the Foundation's Scholar-in-Residence program. She was studying for her nursing exam, surrounded by books and a laptop that worked perfectly. Outside, the hibiscus bloomed red against the green. Upstairs, an older man, slower now but still sharp-eyed, watched from the window. He didn't interrupt. He just smiled, remembering, because the greatest legacy isn't measured in dollars or buildings or titles. It's measured in the lives that keep reaching, keep rising, long after the first hand has let go. And in that quiet house on that ordinary street, the light under the door still glowed late into the night, proof that hope once planted never stops growing.